This can't be real. Grandpa, what did you hide down here? A gull wing, an alloy gull wing, gold. All of this is gold.
Nothing cuts deeper than a father's absolute unyielding rejection. Cast out with almost nothing, and the deed to a charred, forgotten ruin, one man believed his future was completely eradicated. Instead, a rusted padlock on an overgrown, heavily fortified shed was about to make him a multimillionaire. Anthony Gray sat in the suffocatingly plush waiting room of Mitchell and Associates, his tailored but fraying suit a stark contrast to the opulence around him. The air smelled of expensive leather, lemon polish, and the quiet, crushing weight of immense wealth. For 32 years, Anthony had tried to fit into the rigid, unforgiving mold his father, Ronald Gray, had forged. Ronald had been a titan of Chicago commercial real estate, a man who measured human worth strictly in profit margins, hostile takeovers, and ruthlessness. Anthony, with his degree in historical architecture and a quiet, empathetic demeanor, had always been a profound disappointment. The heavy mahogany doors swung open. A paralegal with a severe bun gestured for him to enter the conference room. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Seated at the head of the long glass table was Gregory Mitchell, the family's longtime estate attorney, looking uncomfortable behind a stack of manila folders. To his right sat Cynthia, Ronald's third wife, draped in a black designer dress that looked more suited for a gala than mourning. Beside her was her biological son, Brandon Hayes. Brandon was currently scrolling on his phone, a smug, barely concealed smirk playing on his lips. Brandon had been everything Ronald wanted in a son. Ruthless, arrogant, and perfectly willing to eviscerate a struggling mom-and-pop store to build a parking garage. Anthony took a seat at the far end of the table, feeling the familiar, cold knot of anxiety tighten in his stomach. His father had passed away suddenly of a massive coronary 2 weeks prior. The funeral had been a grand, hollow affair filled with politicians and business rivals. Anthony had stood in the back, mourning not the man who had died, but the relationship they had never been able to build. "Let us begin," Mitchell said, clearing his throat and adjusting his spectacles. "We are here for the final reading and execution of the last will and testament of Ronald Thomas Gray." The attorney began to read through the exhaustive list of assets. It was a dizzying parade of wealth. There were the high-rises in the Loop, the sprawling estate in Lake Forest, the offshore holding companies, the stock portfolios, and the luxury vehicles. As Mitchell droned on, a sickening reality began to settle over Anthony. Everything, every single substantial asset, every business interest, every property of value was being systematically handed over to Cynthia and Brandon. "To my stepson, Brandon Hayes, I leave the controlling shares of Gray Holdings, confident in his ability to manage the enterprise with the necessary conviction," Mitchell read, his voice betraying a slight tremor. Brandon didn't even look up from his phone, though his smirk widened into a grin. Cynthia dabbed at a completely dry eye with a lace handkerchief. Anthony swallowed hard. He hadn't expected the business. He didn't want the business. But he had hoped for something, perhaps the small trust fund his late mother had supposedly set up, or enough capital to finally start the preservation firm he had spent years drafting business plans for. Mitchell shuffled the thick vellum pages, slowing down. He looked up, his eyes meeting Anthony's with profound pity. And finally, "To my biological son, Anthony Gray." Anthony sat up straighter. "The document reads as follows," Mitchell continued, his voice dropping an octave. "To Anthony, who has spent his life gazing backward at history, rather than building a future, I leave a lesson in reality. I leave him the sum of $42, the exact amount I had in my pocket when I arrived in this city to build my empire. Let us see what he can build with it." A sharp bark of laughter escaped Brandon. Cynthia placed a manicured hand over her son's arm, though she was smiling too. Mitchell wasn't finished. "Additionally, I leave Anthony the deed to the property in Oconee County, North Carolina, originally belonging to my estranged father, Harrison Gray. As Anthony is so fond of ruins in the past, he may have it. The property is currently assessed at $0 due to extensive fire damage, but the taxes are paid through the end of the year." Anthony felt the blood drain from his face. A roaring sound filled his ears. It wasn't just a disinheritance. It was a calculated, theatrical humiliation. His father had orchestrated this final moment from beyond the grave to ensure Anthony felt entirely worthless. That's it?" Anthony managed to whisper, his voice cracking. "What about my mother's trust?" Mitchell sighed heavily, looking down at his notes. "I'm sorry, Anthony. Your father legally dissolved that trust 3 years ago to fold the capital into a new commercial development. He was entirely within his legal rights as the primary executor. The $42 and the Oconee deed are the entirety of your inheritance." Brandon leaned forward, finally putting his phone face down on the glass table. Look on the bright side, Artie, he sneered. I hear North Carolina is beautiful this time of year. You can build a tent on your little pile of ashes. Meanwhile, I have a board meeting at 2. Are we done here, Greg? Anthony didn't wait for the attorney's dismissal. He stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. He felt entirely numb. He had $1,500 in his checking account, a 10-year-old sedan, and an eviction notice looming over his modest apartment because he had spent his savings trying to keep his father's pet historical project a theater. Ronald ultimately demolished any way afloat. He walked out of the conference room, out of the mahogany-clad offices, and into the biting Chicago wind. He stood on the pavement, clutching a thin manila envelope Mitchell's paralegal had shoved into his hands on his way out. Inside was a cashier's check for $42 and a wrinkled, yellowing property deed. He had nothing left in this city. He had been erased from his own family's legacy. Looking down at the deed, he read the location: a remote postal route deep in the Appalachian foothills. His grandfather, Harrison Gray, was a ghost in the family lore. Ronald had hated Harrison just as much as he seemed to hate Anthony. Harrison had been an eccentric, a man who supposedly turned his back on society decades ago, retreating to the mountains until his death. Shortly after Harrison passed, the local authorities reported that his cabin had burned to the ground. Ronald had never even gone down to claim the body, letting the county handle a pauper's burial, and had ignored the property entirely. Anthony ran a hand through his hair. He was broke, humiliated, and utterly alone. But as he looked at the unforgiving steel and glass skyscrapers of Chicago, a sudden, fierce defiance sparked in his chest. He would not give his father the satisfaction of breaking him completely. He would go to North Carolina. He would see this ruined land. If nothing else, he would have a place to stand that was entirely his own, even if it was made of ashes. The drive from Chicago to the Blue Ridge Mountains was a grueling, 2-day journey of mechanical terror. Anthony's ancient Honda sedan rattled and shook as it climbed the winding, steep elevation of the Appalachian roads. By the time he crossed into Oconee County, the transmission was slipping terribly, and the check engine light was glowing a bright, angry orange. The GPS on his phone had lost its signal 3 miles back, leaving him to navigate by the vague, hand-drawn map attached to the back of the property deed. The paved highway gave way to a cracked 2-lane road, which eventually devolved into a rutted, deeply neglected dirt path completely swallowed by towering pines and thick, suffocating vines of kudzu. Finally, the dirt track ended abruptly at a rusted, heavy iron gate that had sagged off its hinges, half buried in the mud. Beyond it lay his inheritance. Anthony parked the car, the engine hissing and ticking as it cooled in the humid afternoon air. He grabbed a heavy canvas duffel bag from the passenger seat, containing his few clothes, some basic hand tools, a cheap tent, and canned food, and pushed his way past the gate. The property was a desolate scar on the beautiful mountainous landscape. Nature was trying its best to reclaim the land, but the devastation was still starkly obvious. In the center of a large clearing stood the blackened, skeletal remains of a large log cabin. Only the massive stone chimney remained fully intact, reaching up toward the sky like a lone, defiant gravestone. The rest of the house was a collapsed jumble of charred timber, melted glass, and rusted appliances, all covered in a creeping blanket of green moss and weeds. Anthony walked slowly toward the ruins, his boots crunching on the cinder-strewn ground. The smell of old smoke still hung faintly in the air, deeply baked into the soil. He dropped his duffel bag on a relatively flat patch of grass near the tree line and let out a long, exhausted breath. Brandon was right. He had inherited a pile of ashes. For the next 2 days, Anthony lived in a state of grim survival. He pitched his tent, built a small fire ring, and began the backbreaking work of clearing debris. He didn't know what he was looking for, perhaps something salvageable, perhaps just a way to exhaust his body so his mind would stop looping the memory of his father's cruel will. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, a battered Ford pickup truck rumbled up the dirt path, stopping behind Anthony's sedan. An older man with a deeply lined face, wearing faded denim overalls and a faded tractor cap, stepped out. He walked with a slight limp, his thumbs hooked casually into his suspenders. "You must be Ronald's boy," the man called out, his voice a slow, gravelly drawl. Anthony paused, wiping a mixture of sweat and soot from his forehead. "I am Anthony Gray. Did you know my father?" The man spat a stream of tobacco juice into the weeds. "Met him once, about 20 years ago. Didn't care much for him. Too tightly wound. I'm Tobias Henderson. I own the farm over the ridge there. Knew your grandfather Harrison, though. Knew him real well." Anthony walked over, extending a dirty hand, which Tobias shook with surprising strength. "You knew Harrison? My father never spoke of him. Only that he was crazy." Tobias chuckled, a dry, raspy sound. Crazy? Depends on who you ask. Harrison was a brilliant man, an engineer back in the day. But he saw the world changing, saw men like your father getting greedy, and he checked out. Decided he trusted steel, dirt, and his own two hands more than any bank or corporation. He was a prepper before they had a fancy word for it. What happened to the house? Anthony asked, looking back at the chimney. The lawyer said it burned down right after he died. Tobias's eyes narrowed slightly, staring at the ruins. It was a strange thing. Harrison died of a stroke in his sleep. County came and got him. 3 days later, in the dead of night, the place went up like a Roman candle. Fire marshals said it was old wiring, but I always thought it was funny. Harrison was meticulous. His wiring was perfect. I always suspected he rigged the place to burn, if anyone came snooping after he passed. Rigged it? Anthony asked, incredulous. Why? Because he didn't want his son getting his hands on his life, Tobias said bluntly. He knew Ronald would just sell everything off. Harrison spent the last 10 years of his life building something back there, dragging heavy loads up this mountain in the middle of the night. Tobias pointed a calloused finger past the burnt ruins, toward a dense, almost impenetrable thicket of ancient rhododendrons at the far back edge of the property. I don't know what he was doing, Tobias continued, but he fortified it like a bunker. When the fire marshal came, they didn't even bother looking back there, too overgrown. Assumed the fire took everything. But if you're looking for anything left of your grandfather, I'd start chopping through that brush. Tobias left shortly after, leaving Anthony with a jug of fresh well water and a profound sense of curiosity. Anthony grabbed a rusted machete he had found in the debris and walked toward the thicket Tobias had pointed out. The vegetation here was incredibly dense, the branches weaving together into a solid wooden wall. For over an hour, Anthony hacked and slashed, his arms burning with lactic acid, thorns tearing at his shirt and forearms. Suddenly, the blade struck something solid with a harsh, metallic clang. Anthony froze. He pulled back the heavy vines and gasped. Hidden entirely by the overgrowth was a structure that did not belong in the middle of a forest. At first glance, it looked like a simple, dilapidated wooden shed, covered in cheap, corrugated tin. But as Anthony ripped away the ivy, the illusion broke. The corrugated tin was just a facade, bolted onto heavy, military-grade reinforced steel plates. The structure was large, about the size of a 3-car garage, and set deep into the bedrock of the hillside. He moved to the front. There were no windows. The only entrance was a massive set of double steel doors, resembling the doors of a bank vault more than a shed. They were painted a dull, camouflage green, and they were locked. Anthony stared at the locking mechanism. This was no ordinary padlock. It was a massive, custom-built hardened steel box, welded directly over the seam of the doors. Threaded through a thick titanium hasp was a high-security industrial alloy lock, the kind used on shipping containers and military armories, designed to withstand drills, bolt cutters, and liquid nitrogen. He yanked on the handle. The doors didn't even rattle. They were sealed airtight. Anthony stepped back, his heart pounding against his ribs. His father had thought he was giving him a worthless, burned-out piece of garbage. Ronald hadn't known about the shed. Nobody knew. Harrison had successfully hidden this fortress from the world, and then died, leaving whatever was inside sealed away in the dark. Anthony looked down at his blistered, soot-stained hands. He had exactly $42 from his father, and about $1,000 left to his name. He was completely alone. But as he looked up at the impenetrable steel doors, a fierce, burning determination washed over him. He was going to get inside. The next morning, Anthony drove his sputtering sedan into the nearest town, a small community called Seneca. He went straight to the local hardware store, and then to an equipment rental yard. He quickly realized that hiring a professional locksmith to drill an industrial alloy lock on a reinforced vault would cost hundreds, if not thousands of dollars he simply didn't have. Furthermore, he didn't want anyone else knowing what was out there. If word got around a small mountain town that a vault had been found on the old gray property, it would attract unwanted attention. He spent nearly a third of his remaining cash renting a heavy-duty portable gasoline generator, a commercial-grade Makita angle grinder, 10 high-carbon steel cutting discs, a crowbar, and a pair of thick leather welding gloves. By the time he maneuvered the heavy equipment back to the clearing, the midday sun was beating down relentlessly, turning the humid air into a thick soup. Anthony dragged the generator through the cleared path in the thicket, setting it down a few yards from the steel doors. He fueled it, pulled the starter cord, and the engine roared to life, shattering the quiet of the mountain forest. He plugged in the angle grinder, affixed the first cutting disc, and pulled down his protective goggles. He approached the massive steel housing that protected the lock. Taking a deep breath, he squeezed the trigger. The grinder screamed to life. Anthony pressed the spinning disc against the thick titanium hasp. Instantly, a shower of brilliant, white-hot sparks erupted, ricocheting off the steel doors and his heavy leather gloves. The noise was deafening, a high-pitched metallic shriek that echoed off the surrounding trees. Progress was agonizingly slow. The metal was incredibly dense, designed specifically to resist this exact type of attack. Within 10 minutes, his first cutting disc had ground down to a useless nub, and he had only managed to score a shallow groove into the hasp. Anthony swapped the disc. He went back to work. Hours passed. The sun began to dip behind the tree line, casting long, eerie shadows across the ruined property. Anthony was covered in a thick layer of metallic dust and sweat. His arms vibrated violently from the kickback of the grinder, his muscles screaming in protest. Every time he wanted to quit, every time his exhaustion threatened to overtake him, the memory of Brandon's smug face and his father's final, cruel joke flashed in his mind. $42. Let us see what he can build with it. Watch me, Anthony hissed through gritted teeth, bearing down on the grinder with every ounce of his body weight. Crack. On the seventh cutting disc, the titanium hasp finally gave way. The metal fractured with a loud pop, the heavy lock dropping into the dirt with a dull thud. Anthony killed the grinder. The sudden silence in the forest was deafening. He dropped the tool, his hands shaking violently as he stepped up to the double doors. He grabbed the heavy steel latch lever. It was stiff, rusted shut from years of disuse. He wedged the crowbar behind the handle and threw his entire weight backward. With a harsh, agonizing groan of metal scraping against metal, the internal locking bolt slid back. Anthony dropped the crowbar. He grabbed both handles and pulled. The heavy doors, perfectly balanced on massive, greased internal hinges, swung outward with a deep, echoing sigh, breaking a vacuum seal that had held for nearly a decade. A wave of air washed over him. It didn't smell like rot or damp earth. It smelled distinctly of old motor oil, dried canvas, aged leather, and something metallic and sharp. Anthony pulled a heavy-duty LED flashlight from his belt and stepped into the absolute darkness of the vault. He clicked the light on. The beam sliced through the dust motes dancing in the air, illuminating the interior. Anthony stopped breathing. The shed was massive, stretching deep into the hillside, its walls lined with industrial shelving. But his eyes were immediately drawn to the center of the concrete floor. Sitting there, resting on 4 heavy jack stands to protect its tires, was an object of such profound beauty and engineering perfection that Anthony, an architectural historian, immediately recognized its unparalleled significance. It was a car, but not just any car. Gleaming under the harsh beam of the flashlight was a flawless, pristine 1954 Mercedes-Benz 300 SL Gullwing, its iconic doors shut tight, its silver paint practically glowing in the dark. It was immaculate. It looked as though it had rolled off the factory floor yesterday. Anthony knew enough about vintage automobiles to know that a standard Gullwing in this condition was worth millions. But as he stepped closer, his flashlight caught the subtle, aggressive modifications to the bodywork, the side exit exhausts, and the bare, stripped-down racing interior. This wasn't a standard Gullwing. This was an ultra-rare, factory-built aluminum alloy-bodied 300 SL, one of only 29 ever produced in the world. It was a holy grail of the automotive industry, an absolute myth thought to be lost to history. Its value wasn't in the millions, it was in the tens of millions. Anthony reached out, his trembling, soot-stained hand hovering an inch above the immaculate silver hood, terrified that if he touched it, it would vanish like a mirage. "Grandpa Harrison," Anthony whispered to the empty room. "What on earth did you do?" But the car was only the beginning. Dragging his eyes away from the Mercedes, Anthony swept the flashlight beam toward the back wall. Stacked floor to ceiling were dozens of heavy, olive-drab military surplus crates. They were secured with heavy steel banding. He practically ran to the back, grabbing his crowbar. He wedged the iron tip under the lid of the nearest crate and violently wrenched it upward. The wood splintered, and the lid popped off. Inside, wrapped tightly in heavy oiled canvas, were rows of rectangular, heavy objects. Anthony pulled back the canvas. The yellow beam of the flashlight caught the unmistakable, dull gleam of precious metal. The crate was packed tightly with hundreds of 1-ounce solid gold Krugerrand coins and thick, heavy silver bullion bars, neatly stacked and meticulously organized. Anthony's knees finally gave out. He collapsed onto the cold concrete floor, surrounded by a fortune that defied comprehension. The $42 cashier's check was still folded in his back pocket, a cruel joke that had just violently, spectacularly backfired. His father, the great ruthless titan of industry, had given away a kingdom simply because he was too arrogant to look in the dirt. Anthony sat in the dark, the flashlight beam resting on the silver hood of the gullwing, and for the first time in his entire life, he began to laugh. Paranoia set in almost instantly. Anthony sat in the darkness of the reinforced steel vault for hours, the reality of his situation settling heavily over his shoulders. He was sitting on tens of millions of dollars in untraceable gold, silver bullion, and an automotive holy grail, completely alone in the middle of a remote Appalachian forest. The rusted gate and the dense thicket of rhododendrons were no longer enough to protect him. He needed cash, he needed security, and most importantly, he needed absolute legal supremacy before his stepbrother found out. Working through the night under the glow of his LED flashlight, Anthony meticulously documented every inch of the vault. He recorded the chassis and engine numbers of the Mercedes-Benz 300 SL alloy gullwing, taking dozens of high-resolution photos. He pried open a few more crates, finding the same astonishingly neat stacks of Krugerrands. Before dawn broke, Anthony took 5 of the 1-ounce gold coins, slipping them into his heavy denim jacket. He resealed the vault, carefully maneuvering the massive doors shut and wedging the broken titanium hasp back into place to make it look undisturbed from a distance. He covered the entrance with freshly cut vines and branches, erasing his tracks as best he could. He drove 3 hours to Charlotte, nursing his failing sedan every mile. He found a high-end, reputable precious metals dealer in the financial district. Sweating through his soot-stained shirt, Anthony placed the 5 Krugerrands on the velvet mat of the dealer's counter. The transaction was seamless. The gold was flawless. He walked out with a little over $12,000 in a cashier's check and a few thousand in crisp cash. His first call was to a private security firm. By nightfall, 2 armed, off-duty military contractors were camped in a stealth RV, discreetly parked just inside the rusted iron gate of the Oconee property, equipped with motion sensors and thermal cameras. His second call was to Evelyn Croft, a notoriously ruthless high-stakes property litigator based in Atlanta. Evelyn was expensive, sharp, and possessed a distinct hatred for the corporate bullying tactics Anthony's father and stepbrother frequently employed. When Anthony showed her the photographs of the vault and the copy of his father's will in her high-rise office, Evelyn's eyes widened behind her designer frames. "Your father thought he was leaving you a scorched patch of worthless dirt," Evelyn said, tapping a manicured nail against the grainy photo of the Mercedes. "The wording in Ronald's will is absolute. The property, he may have it." In North Carolina, unless explicitly severed by a separate legal instrument, the conveyance of land includes all fixtures, buildings, and subterranean structures upon it. However, the contents of the chattel could be contested. "We need to establish an airtight chain of ownership before your stepbrother catches wind of this. But secrets of this magnitude have a way of defying containment." Anthony had to authenticate the gullwing. He reached out to a senior appraiser at a premier international auction house, sending only the chassis number and a single tight photograph of the alloy bodywork. The response was immediate and frantic. The appraiser flew to North Carolina the next day. When the expert finally stood inside the vault and ran a white-gloved hand over the silver fenders, he wept. It was the lost alloy, a legendary factory custom build that had vanished from European registries in the late 1970s. The appraiser's enthusiasm proved to be the weak link. A whisper in the vintage automotive community reached a broker in New York who casually mentioned the miraculous discovery to a wealthy collector during a dinner party. That collector happened to sit on the executive board of Gray Holdings. 3 days later, Anthony's burner phone rang. It was Brandon. "You sneaky, pathetic little rat," Brandon hissed, his voice trembling with a terrifying mixture of rage and panic. "Did you really think you could hide this from me? Did you think you could steal millions of dollars from Gray Holdings?" "I didn't steal anything, Brandon," Anthony replied calmly, stepping out of his tent and looking toward the RV where his armed guards were stationed. "My father left me the property. It was all in the will. $42 in the ashes. Remember? That car and that gold belonged to Harrison Gray," Brandon screamed through the receiver. "When Harrison died, his estate legally transferred to Ronald, and Ronald's estate transferred to me. You are trespassing on my assets. I have Mitchell filing an emergency injunction right now. I'm freezing the property. If you touch so much as a single coin, I will have you buried in federal prison for grand larceny." The line went dead. Anthony felt a cold spike of adrenaline. Brandon wasn't just angry, he was desperate. And a desperate man with infinite resources was incredibly dangerous. Evelyn Croft called 20 minutes later. "We have a problem, Anthony," she said, her tone all business. Brandon just filed a massive injunction in the federal court. He's claiming the contents of the vault are abandoned personal property belonging to Ronald's estate. He is sending a private recovery team to seize the assets pending litigation. Can he do that? Anthony asked, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the phone. He can try to drag this out in court for a decade until you run out of money to fight him, Evelyn warned. We have a hearing in front of a federal judge in 72 hours to challenge the injunction. We need a silver bullet, Anthony. We need proof that Harrison intentionally kept those assets out of Ronald's hands, or Brandon is going to bleed you dry. Anthony hung up and walked back into the vault. The air felt heavy. He looked at the magnificent silver gullwing, then at the crates of gold. His grandfather had spent a decade building this fortress, pouring his genius and his paranoia into securing his legacy. Harrison had known his son Ronald was a shark. He wouldn't have just left a pile of treasure sitting in the dark hoping for the best. Harrison was an engineer. Engineers don't leave things to chance. They build fail-safes. Anthony grabbed his flashlight and walked over to the Mercedes. He had been so captivated by the exterior that he hadn't fully scoured the interior. He opened the heavy, upward-swinging driver's side door and climbed into the plush, red leather racing seat. He opened the glove box. Empty. He checked beneath the floor mats. Nothing. Frustrated, he slid out and popped the rear trunk. Inside lay the original spare tire, some vintage German tools wrapped in canvas, and a small, heavy iron lockbox bolted directly to the chassis of the car. Anthony's heart leaped into his throat. He ran to his tool bag, grabbing a heavy pry bar and a hammer. It took 10 minutes of aggressive, sweat-drenched prying, but the rusted locking mechanism finally snapped. Inside the box was a thick, sealed manila envelope, perfectly preserved in a vacuum-sealed plastic bag. Anthony tore it open. It was a stack of legal documents, notarized and stamped by a prominent North Carolina trust attorney 15 years ago. At the very top was a handwritten letter on thick, yellowed stationery. Anthony unfolded it and began to read. A slow, triumphant smile spread across his face. The federal courthouse in Asheville was a grand, imposing structure of polished marble and echoing halls. Anthony sat at the defendant's table next to Evelyn Croft, wearing a crisp, newly tailored Navy suit purchased with his recently acquired funds. Across the aisle sat Brandon Hayes and Cynthia, flanked by Gregory Mitchell and a team of 3 aggressive-looking corporate litigators from Chicago. Brandon looked furious, his leg bouncing erratically under the mahogany table. Cynthia glared at Anthony with a mixture of contempt and disbelief. Judge Eleanor Vance, a no-nonsense jurist with 30 years on the bench, called the hearing to order. "Counselor," Judge Vance said, looking down at Brandon's lead litigator. "You are asking this court to grant an emergency seizure of assets located on private property owned by the defendant. The basis of your claim is that these assets, a highly valuable vintage automobile and substantial precious metals, are the rightful property of Gray Holdings." The corporate lawyer stood, buttoning his jacket. "Yes, Your Honor. The assets were hidden by the late Harrison Gray. Upon his death, his estate defaulted to his only son, Ronald Gray. Ronald, tragically unaware of the hidden vault, passed his entire estate to my client, Mr. Brandon Hayes. The defendant, Anthony Gray, inherited only the land itself. The chattel hidden beneath it clearly belongs to the primary estate. We request immediate possession to prevent the defendant from liquidating our client's property." Judge Vance nodded slowly, turning her gaze to Evelyn Croft. "Miss Croft, your client seems to have stumbled into a rather lucrative loophole. Do you have a defense against this chain of succession?" Evelyn stood up gracefully, holding a thick leather binder. "We have more than a defense, Your Honor. We have the absolute, undeniable will of the original owner." Evelyn walked to the center of the courtroom and handed a copy of the documents to the bailiff, who passed them to the judge. She then handed a second copy to Brandon's legal team. "3 days ago, my client discovered a lockbox secured inside the vehicle in question," Evelyn stated, her voice projecting clearly across the silent courtroom. "Inside were the founding documents for a legal entity called the Foundation of the Phoenix. 10 years before his death, Harrison Gray legally transferred ownership of the vault, the Mercedes-Benz, and every ounce of gold and silver into this corporate trust." Brandon leaned over, frantically reading the document over his lawyer's shoulder. The lawyer's face was rapidly draining of color. "And who is the beneficiary of this trust?" Judge Vance asked, adjusting her reading glasses. "That is the brilliant part, Your Honor," Evelyn smiled. "Harrison Gray detested his son, Ronald. He knew Ronald would plunder his wealth. So, Harrison structured the trust with a highly specific, unbreakable conditional clause. The trust dictates that its assets belong entirely and exclusively to whoever holds the legal deed to the Oconee County property at the exact moment the vault seal is broken. The trust is permanently bound to the land." A collective gasp echoed from Brandon's table. Gregory Mitchell pulled off his glasses, rubbing his eyes in utter defeat. Evelyn turned to face Brandon directly. Ronald Gray, in his infinite arrogance, transferred the deed to Anthony to mock him. In doing so, he legally transferred the keys to the kingdom. When Anthony broke the seal on that vault, the trust executed automatically. The gold, the car, the vault, it all belongs to Anthony Gray. Brandon Hayes has absolutely zero legal claim to any of it. "This is absurd!" Brandon shouted, slamming his hands on the table and standing up. "It's a forgery! He made it up to steal my inheritance!" "Mr. Hayes, sit down and remain silent, or I will have you removed and held in contempt," Judge Vance barked, slamming her gavel. She looked back down at the paperwork, reviewing the notary stamps and the signatures. After a long, agonizing minute of silence, the judge looked up. "These documents are authenticated by a registered state attorney and filed properly with the county clerk over a decade ago," Judge Vance ruled, her tone final. "The trust structure is highly unusual, but it is entirely legal. Harrison Gray went to great lengths to ensure his son never touched this wealth. Ronald Gray unknowingly gave it away. The injunction is denied. The assets belong to Anthony Gray." Brandon's face contorted into an ugly mask of rage. Cynthia let out a sharp sob, covering her face. Anthony sat perfectly still, listening to the sharp crack of the judge's gavel. It was over. The weight of 32 years of inadequacy, rejection, and emotional abuse evaporated into the air-conditioned courtroom air. His grandfather had reached through time, bypassing a cruel son, to save a grandson he had never even met. The aftermath was swift and heavily publicized. Anthony officially contracted Barrington & Co. to auction the 1954 Mercedes-Benz 300 SL alloy gullwing. It sold to a private European collector for a staggering $34 million, setting a world record for the chassis. The gold and silver bullion provided another $12 million in liquid capital. Anthony did not return to Chicago. He bought the sprawling farmland adjacent to his grandfather's property from Tobias, the old farmer who had pointed him toward the thicket. He spent $2 million completely restoring Harrison's original log cabin, turning the burnt ruins into a magnificent architectural tribute to the grandfather who had saved his life. With his vast fortune, Anthony finally launched the historical preservation firm he had dreamed of. He spent his days saving beautiful, forgotten pieces of history from the wrecking ball, funding massive restoration projects across the country. Meanwhile, Brandon's fortunes took a drastic turn. Desperate to prove himself without his stepfather's guidance, Brandon over-leveraged Gray Holdings on a series of disastrous commercial developments. Without the liquid capital he had counted on, the capital he foolishly thought was hidden in North Carolina, the company defaulted on its loans. Within 3 years, Gray Holdings was dissolved, its assets sold off for pennies on the dollar by the banks. Brandon was left with nothing but his arrogance and a tarnished name. On a crisp autumn morning, Anthony stood on the heavy timber porch of his newly rebuilt mountain home. The rusted steel vault remained hidden in the thicket, now repurposed as a secure archive for his firm's most delicate historical blueprints. He sipped his coffee, looking out over the misty Appalachian Valley, deeply at peace. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, framed piece of paper. It was the $42 cashier's check his father had given him. He had never cashed it. Instead, he kept it as a reminder that value isn't determined by those who try to break you, but by the foundation you choose to build upon the ashes they leave behind. If this incredible story of ultimate revenge, hidden multi-million-dollar fortunes, and poetic justice kept you hooked until the very end, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this video with anyone who loves a brilliant plot twist, where the underdog wins big against a toxic family. Subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss out on our daily dramatic stories. Let us know your favorite part in the comments below.